Hi, this is Sue Glenn, and we're going to be talking about competition between different species. But to start with, I'm going to be talking about competition within a species, which is intraspecific competition. I'm following the textbook by Manuel, Molles, and Sher called Ecology, Concepts, and Applications. It's the 8th edition, which was published by McGraw-Hill in 2019. Up until now, we have had some uh, videos talking about population abundance and distribution, population density, talking about population age structure, population growth. And a lot of these things where we were dealing with logistic growth, we were talking about competition within a species population. So that is intraspecific competition, which is one of several types of interactions between individuals. Uh, we're going to be talking about competition between species, which is interspecific competition as well, but we need to understand intraspecific competition before we move on to interspecific competition. Why is competition studied? It's one of the most popular things in ecology to study is competition. It used to be we like to study how everything worked together. And then following the Second World War in the West, we switched to looking at individual freedom and competition and sort of changed our focus. So competition is really important in understanding evolution by natural selection. Within a population, you obviously have competition for limited resources, and those that are best adapted in that particular environment are the ones that are going to survive and reproduce. We know it's an important organizer of nature. It has a lot of practical applications when we're talking about tree plantations or farming or gardening, uh, crop spacing, and it also has a lot of importance in understanding how to protect biodiversity and the conservation of biodiversity. It's important to understand who's competing with who and how that's working in an ecosystem. There are different types of competition. The ones that are popular on Animal Planet are interference competition, and that's where you have direct aggression between individuals within the population. And, you know, that could be that they are being defending their territory. That could be sort of an aggressive protection of their particular place where they're getting their food. You might have chemical toxins that are produced that harm potential competitors, and that's something that plants do. It's called the allelopathy in plants. Plants could compete with each other aggressively by growing over them and reducing their access to light. So you might have some sort of direct interference with the other organism. You can have resource or exploitative competition. You take all the resources from somebody else. Uh, we have interest-specific competition, which is competition with members of your own species. People, we know a lot about that. We compete with each other constantly for limited resources. And interspecific competition is competition between individuals of two species, and this is going to hurt both of them. So it reduces the fitness of both species to be called competition. It has to have a negative impact on both species. This particular lecture is on intraspecific competition, and then we'll move on to interspecific competition. It's annoying that these words sound so similar, so it's important to sort of keep them clear in your mind. Inter is between species, intra within a species. We're going to start off by talking about interspecific competition among herbaceous plants. These are plants that die back to the ground every winter. Something like your grasses, this is Indian grass that'll stay alive for the winter underground and then resprout in the spring. Herbaceous plants could also be something like annual plants as well. So plant growth rates and weights have been found to increase in low density populations. So the fewer in the population, there's less competition, and they grow faster and they get bigger. You have increased biomass. So this is looking in the textbook. They go over an example with David Tillman and Cohen that was published in 1989 to look at how the root to shoot ratios responded to soil nitrogen. And in doing those experiments, they have evidence for intraspecific competition. So the species they were looking at was Sergastrum nutans, which is Indian grass. This is a tall grass prairie plant in North America. And they grew the grass at low density, 7 plants per pot. And then they grew it at high density at 100 plants per pot. And those grown at the low density grew to a larger size. No matter how much nitrogen they gave them, they were still doing better with the low density. And so they were suggesting that competition for nitrogen was more intense at the higher plant populations, and that at the lower plant populations, the plants could grow to much larger sizes. And this competition for limited resources sort of in a natural population, was probably leading to mortality among the competing plants. So there's a picture of David Tillman, and this is the data that they found. So the red is showing you the Indian grass that were growing at 100 plants per pot. So the red line across the bottom is all of the high density ones, and it didn't matter how much soil nitrogen they gave them, they didn't really do much better. And then the blue line, or the blue dots, are showing you the data for when they grew them at only 7 plants per pot. And the more nitrogen they gave them, the better they were doing, so they could grow to much bigger plants. The y-axis here is the amount of biomass in each individual plant, and then the x-axis across the bottom is the amount of nitrogen in the soil. So competition for resources occurred at all densities, but it was more intense with the higher population densities, the little red dots. So this usually leads to mortality among competing plants. And a little picture down the side is just a diagram showing you that we're not just looking at competition above ground, we're looking at below ground competition, and there's extensive root systems for these tallgrass prairie plants. Tallgrass prairie has extremely deep, rich soils, and the plants can grow very extensive root systems, especially since they're perennials, and those roots will just keep expanding year after year. This phenomenon with the competing plants are outcompeting each other, basically killing off their competitors within their population, is known as self-thinning. So we're going to talk about self-thinning. So self-thinning in plants results from intraspecific competition for limited resources. We can also find this in sessile animal communities, such as something like barnacles. As a local population of plants develops, individual plants take up increasing quantities of nutrients as they grow. It could be nutrients, it could be water, could be space that they're competing for. And some of the individuals are more successful at competing for that space or that nutrient than others. The losers in the competition will die, and the population density over time decreases, it thins out. So over time, the population is composed of fewer and fewer large individuals. So here on the right-hand side, we can see that we have planted some little tree saplings in the top picture at very high densities. So they're very close to each other. So we have a whole bunch of little tree seedlings. And they're not competing with each other above ground or below ground. The growth of each one is proceeding quite quickly. We have quite a few of them. But then as they get bigger, you can see that they're going to start competing with each other, and mortality is starting to occur. So some of them are just not going to be able to get enough light or enough water or nutrients. And this can be going above ground or below ground. So because these guys are being wiped out over time, the density of the population, there's fewer of these trees, so the density reduces, and then there's more nutrients available or more light or whatever it is they're competing for the remaining individuals, and those ones will be getting individually larger and larger. One way we look at self-thinning is that we're going to plot this on a graph. So the x-axis of this is to look at the population density of the plant. So I'm going to put population density here. So that is the independent variable, and that's going from a low density to a high density. And we're going to actually plot this on a log scale. So I'm going to take the logarithm of population density. And what logarithms are going to do, some of the big numbers, as you get into the very high densities, it's just going to pull it in along the scale. So it's going to pull things on in from the right side into the width of the graph. And then on the x-axis, we are going to do the total plant biomass. So in the whole garden or in the whole plantation, we're going to do total biomass. So that's going from low to high. And once again, we're going to put that on log scale. So the big things get kind of pulled down a little bit as well. I just don't want that to look like we're dealing with a scale going the wrong direction. All right, so what we find is that when we initially plant the plants, we have very high densities, lots of little seeds out there close together, but they're all very small. And then as they get bigger, so we're getting more biomass, but we have more competition, some of them die out. So we're going from having lots of little ones, high density of little ones, to very few lower densities when you finish, but very high biomass. So you get lots of individuals in the very few individuals in the population, but lots of biomass from the population. When we do this plot, we find that on average, the slope of that line, and this is pretty cool, the slope of that line is averages around -1/2, so -0.5. So over time, you're moving from the bottom right of that line, you're moving up to the, let me just give it a little bit of an arrow. You're moving up from the bottom right to the top left over time. And for every change, doubling in density or reducing in density by half, you're going up one level in biomass so the population density declines more rapidly than the biomass will increase. This is the image of it in your textbook. So when we look at the textbook, we have the logarithm of the number of individuals, which is the independent variable, the logarithm of total biomass on the y-axis, and we can see initially you have high numbers of little tiny things, or you could even plant high numbers of little seedlings that are bigger, but over time we're going to find that they will compete for resources, so the density will go down, and as the density goes down, each individual will have actually more resources available for growth so that the biomass will go up. So at this point, you should be able to explain to somebody what self-thinning is, why it occurs, so a competition, which is causing mortality, and freeing up resources for individuals. If we plot the logarithm of plant biomass against the logarithm of density, you should know to put density on the x-axis, that's the independent variable, and the biomass on the y-axis. You know the slope of the line now is -1/2. And you should know that that means that for every unit decrease in density, you have a half unit increase in biomass. We can also look at plotting the individual plant weight. So that was looking at the total plant biomass of the stand. Here we could be looking at the individual plant weight against the density. And the slope of that line actually is known as well. And this is known as the -3/2 law of self-thinning. And if you read through your book, you can see who came up with the -3/2 self-thinning rule. So what you do is you're going to plot the average weight of the individual plant against the density. The slope of the line averages around 3/2. It's called the 3/2 self-thinning rule. And it was first proposed by Yoda and colleagues in 1963. Yoda's obviously into plants and understanding how competition for resources works. So here we're looking at an experiment with alfalfa. Alfalfa is a legume. It's in the pea family. We grow alfalfa as food for livestock because it's in the legume family, has a bacteria that live on its roots that help feed it usable forms of nitrogen, and so it can make lots of protein. So it's a good livestock fodder. And if you plant very high densities of alfalfa, so on the graph here we have the density in plants per square meter, and then you've got the actual dry weight per plant. And once again, remember these are log axes, so that's a log, and that's a log axis if you look at the numbers here. And we can see that this is a much steeper slope than we were seeing for the whole stand. So the whole stand was a slope of -1/2. Here we have a much steeper slope. It's -3/2. And so that over time, as we are moving from high densities to lower densities, the amount of biomass per plant is going up. So each individual plant is significantly bigger as we move from high densities to low densities. This is really useful to apply this when you're planting a plantation of trees, or you're planting a field of vegetables, or you're planting things in your garden or your yard, because you can actually use this knowledge of competition to end up with a higher yield. And so if we look on the left side here, we have seen that they have planted all these little seedlings very close together on the left side, whereas on the right side, the seedlings are spaced further apart, where they're close together on the left. The ones on the left then, because they're in close competition with each other, they are they're growing slower because the competition for resources starts earlier. Whereas the ones that are more spaced out, they're not really overlapping each other as much, and they each have more space to gather resources from. So at when they start to get really big, you can see these are corn plants, and they're starting to compete with each other, and the growth will slow down. But they had a longer time to keep growing quickly and get to a larger size than if we planted them all close together. So we know that the individual plants get bigger. We also know that the total biomass that you get off of it gets higher as well. So this is why you space things that way you plant them. So if you were asked to plot these two different scenarios, if we look at the total biomass, so we're looking at, for both of these graphs, we're looking at the density on the x-axis, so the population density, and this is going to be a log. And then on the y-axis, on this one, we're going to be looking at total biomass. And on the right graph, we're going to be looking at the biomass per plant. And that'll be log and log. And we're going from low numbers to high, low to high. And the same thing on the individual graph. We're going to low to high, low to high. It's surprising to me how many people do that backwards, and I don't understand why. So in general, you do your axis from low to high. And so if we look at the total biomass, we would find a slope going from high density, very low biomass, to as they grow, the density will go down, and the biomass will go up, and the slope of that line is minus 1/2. So that's the slope. This one, we've got the same thing going on. We're going from high densities where we have very small plants to low densities where we have big plants. So we're going in that direction. This one was going in this direction. And in this case, our slope equals minus 3/2. Assuming. So one thing about using these logarithms here is because it's pulling in your big numbers from way up high in the sizes of the plants and way up high in the density of the plants, it straightens the curve into a line. So you're more likely to get a straight line with these slopes. That's why you're doing the logs. So just so you don't think that this is dealing with only plants, we're going to talk about an example of interference competition with terrestrial isopods, particularly the species Porcellus scaber. And this was work done by Edwin Grolsch. He published it in 1992. He studies invertebrates, and he's very interested in actually ones that are associated with people, invasive species. And this little guy is found wherever people live, with farming and gardening all around the world. And he is found it in densities as high as 2,000 individuals per square meter. So that would expect you would expect then to find intraspecific competition. So what he did, he set up 48 plots that were 60 by 60 centimeters in size, and he put in little walls around them that went down into the soil so that they couldn't escape. And then he had, first of all, he tried to see if they had enough food. So was there food limiting them? And he put sliced carrots and potatoes and ones to add in food to see if there would be difference if he added in food. And then to test to see if density made a difference in survivorship, he stocked them with either 100 of these isopods or 50 of them. He found that supplementing the food had no effect on the survival, but at a given density, but the higher density populations had lower survivorship than the low density population. So obviously there was some sort of intraspecific competition going on, but it wasn't really food having a limit on them. The interference was really them eating each other, was cannibalism, which is common in terrestrial isopods. So it's kind of an interesting scenario. When I was trying to get you some pictures of isopods, and I could find some cute little isopod clip art, but I found some videos on YouTube from people that actually collect isopod species, and one of them, the guy was unboxing his isopods he just gotten in the mail, and one of them was this Porcello scaber. So let me show you that video too.
So here's the Porcellio species that's unknown, probably. So here's the Porcellio species that's unknown, probably is a scaber, but again, it's like a unusual pied orange and white. Ashley was calling it the orange Dalmatian. We're thinking it'd be cool to call them creamsicles, creamsicle isopods. They look really neat, as you can see. Look at this little animal. Hello. I'm on a mission. Yeah, super, super cool.
On the side here, honey.
I thought that was pretty cool. I don't know if you've seen the television series Everything's Going to Be Okay, where each episode is named after a different insect. It's a cool little comedy that the portrays an entomologist, and all his insect collections appear in every episode. Anyway, back to Grolsch's work with these cannibalistic isopods. And if you look at the concept review question at the end for you to think about, do you think Grolsch would have observed food limitations if he had used higher densities of Porcellus scaber in his experiment? So you should think about and be able to answer that question. So the next section of the chapter, we're going to be talking about interspecific competition. It's really dealing with the concept of the niche and competitive exclusion. So one population excluding another population, and when can they coexist? So we'll be looking forward to seeing you in the next presentation.